When you and the narcissist both stop reaching out, it may look like everything has finally settled. In reality, that silence marks the beginning of two very different journeys. For you, it opens the door to recovery. For them, it quietly triggers a psychological struggle they never expected. This is the stage people rarely talk about, yet understanding it can help you finally break free from the cycle for good. The first shift that happens inside the narcissist is what could be called a period of mental recalculation. It is not loud or dramatic. Instead, it unfolds privately, long before they decide whether to contact you again. While you may see your silence as a healthy boundary or the first real step toward healing, they interpret it in a completely different way. To a narcissist, silence is not respected as a personal decision. It becomes information that needs to be analyzed. Rather than asking themselves how they caused pain or what they could have done differently, they focus on figuring out why you stopped responding. Their attention turns toward understanding what changed, not accepting responsibility for their behavior. Healthy self-reflection is not where their mind naturally goes. Instead, they begin searching for explanations that protect their ego. They may wonder whether you are trying to punish them, whether someone else has replaced them, or whether your silence is simply another tactic. Every possibility is examined through the lens of control, because uncertainty is deeply uncomfortable for them. During this stage, they may remain completely silent. That silence should never be mistaken for acceptance or emotional maturity. More often, it is a deliberate pause. They may quietly monitor your social media, pay attention to your friendships, or look for clues about your life without making their presence known. They are collecting information while waiting to see whether you will make the first move. Many narcissists assume that anyone they previously controlled will eventually return. Because of that belief, they rarely see your silence as a permanent ending. Instead, they convince themselves that it is only temporary resistance. They expect old patterns to repeat. They count on your guilt, your desire to keep the peace, your fear of conflict, or your hope that things might somehow improve. They assume those emotional habits will eventually pull you back toward them. When that does not happen, their internal calculations begin to change. Confidence slowly turns into uncertainty as they recognize that the influence they once relied on may no longer exist. At that point, your silence becomes something much more threatening because it weakens the power dynamic that once worked in their favor. In their world, silence is never neutral. It either represents another opportunity to regain control or a growing threat to the image they have of themselves. The emotional experience of this silence is completely different for you than it is for them, and that difference reveals one of the hardest truths to accept. While you are carrying the emotional weight of everything that happened, they are mainly dealing with the inconvenience of losing access to you. Your silence is often filled with grief. You are trying to process broken trust, unanswered questions, emotional exhaustion, and the painful realization of everything you tolerated. Sadness, confusion, loneliness, guilt, and self-doubt may all surface at once. You are grieving not only the relationship itself, but also the version of yourself that stayed despite repeated hurt. Choosing silence is often less about punishment and more about survival. Your mind and body have simply reached their limit, and you're trying to reclaim peace, self-respect, and emotional clarity. That healing process can affect every part of your life, from your sleep and confidence to your memories and sense of identity. The narcissist experiences that same silence through an entirely different psychological lens. Instead of reflecting on the damage they caused or considering how they contributed to the relationship's collapse, they focus on what your absence means for them. What disappears is not love, but access. They were accustomed to receiving your attention, your emotional reactions, your reassurance, your apologies, your care, and even your frustration. Every interaction reinforced their sense of importance. Once that constant source of validation disappears, they feel the disruption immediately. This absence does not usually create genuine emotional accountability. Instead, it feels like losing something they had come to expect. The interruption frustrates them because the steady flow of attention has stopped. Their concern is less about losing someone they deeply valued and more about losing reliable access to the emotional validation you once provided. That is why your silence and theirs exist in two completely different psychological realities. You are trying to rebuild yourself after emotional damage, while they are measuring how the loss of your attention affects their sense of control. You are mourning what happened. They are calculating what they no longer have. You are healing from the relationship while they are reacting to the disappearance of the supply that once protected their ego. As the silence stretches on, the contrast between your experience and the narcissist's becomes impossible to ignore. Little by little, you begin to understand just how much of yourself you sacrificed to preserve the relationship. You realize how often you swallowed your feelings, ignored your needs, and accepted emotional strain simply to avoid conflict. Meanwhile, the narcissist is left wondering why the methods that once guaranteed your attention suddenly no longer work. The dynamic that once favored them begins to shift. Your silence leads you inward. It encourages reflection, healing, and a gradual rebuilding of your self-worth. Their silence, however, leads them toward irritation, entitlement, and growing frustration. The weight you carry comes from processing genuine emotional wounds. The discomfort they experience comes from losing the ease with which they once influenced you. To a narcissist, silence is never just silence. It is interpreted as a direct threat to their ego because someone they believed they controlled is no longer responding. Relationships are not viewed through the lens of mutual respect or partnership. Instead, they are filtered through power and influence. When you stop reaching out, stop reacting, and stop providing emotional energy, the hierarchy they believed existed suddenly begins to collapse. Even if your only goal is to protect your peace and regain emotional stability, they rarely see it that way. Instead, they interpret your distance as defiance. In their mind, your silence represents resistance. It signals that their ability to shape your emotions may be slipping away. Ironically, silence often unsettles them far more than confrontation ever could. Arguments still keep them emotionally relevant. Your anger, frustration, or attempts to explain yourself all reinforce the belief that they still occupy an important place in your thoughts. Silence does the opposite. It removes them from the center of your emotional world, and that absence threatens the identity they have carefully built around feeling powerful and indispensable. Without communication, they are left facing uncertainty, something narcissists find extremely difficult to tolerate. Because they cannot easily understand your motives, they create explanations that protect their ego. Rather than believing you are exhausted or choosing healthy boundaries, they convince themselves you are being disrespectful, manipulative, or intentionally trying to provoke them. Some begin treating the silence as a competition they refuse to lose. Others reinterpret it as betrayal, persuading themselves that they have been abandoned despite the pain they repeatedly caused. Instead of honestly examining their own actions, they rewrite the meaning of your silence in ways that preserve their self-image. As these thoughts intensify, their confidence starts to crack. Your silence quietly reflects the insecurity they work so hard to hide. Instead of acknowledging those uncomfortable feelings, they invent stories that restore their sense of superiority. They may reassure themselves that you will eventually return because you always have before. They may even begin planning ways to make you regret your distance, hoping to pull you back into the emotional cycle they once controlled. Deep down, what unsettles them most is the possibility that they no longer have psychological influence over you. While you experience silence as an opportunity to breathe, process, and understand what you've survived, the narcissist experiences something entirely different. Your absence creates a psychological void that confronts them with the one thing they spend their lives trying to avoid, the loss of control. They do not naturally think in terms of mutual boundaries or respectful distance. Instead, your withdrawal feels like damage to the system they rely on to maintain their identity. Their self-worth is not built on genuine inner confidence. It depends heavily on external attention, admiration, emotional reactions, and validation from the people around them. You became an important source of that reinforcement once your participation disappears. The foundation supporting their fragile self-image begins to weaken. As days become weeks, what first seemed like a temporary inconvenience grows into something much larger. Internally, anxiety begins to build, even if they hide it behind anger, arrogance, or icy indifference. They notice that the familiar tactics no longer produce results. The guilt trips receive no response. Emotional withdrawal no longer makes you chase them. Subtle insults fail to pull you back into defending yourself. Instead, they are met with complete silence. That absence of emotional feedback creates growing instability. In healthy relationships, periods of silence can encourage reflection, understanding, and personal growth. Within a narcissistic dynamic, however, silence removes the constant validation they depend upon. Without someone reflecting back the image they want to see, they are left facing an emptiness they have spent years trying to escape. Because that feeling is so uncomfortable, they often protect themselves by shifting responsibility onto you. They convince themselves that you are the one behaving cruelly, playing games, or lacking compassion. By casting themselves as the injured party, they preserve the belief that they remain morally justified. To strengthen that version of events, they may begin telling others how cold, unfair, or heartless you have become. The story is rewritten so their harmful behavior fades into the background while your silence becomes the supposed offense. In many cases, these smear campaigns are less about truth and more about provoking a response. If they can make you defend yourself, explain yourself, or react emotionally, then the silence is broken, and with it, they regain a measure of the control they fear they have lost. They want you to argue, they want you to break down, defend yourself, or prove them wrong. Any emotional reaction reassures them that they still occupy a powerful place in your mind. As long as you respond, they can convince themselves they still have influence over your emotions. When you stay silent, instead of defending yourself or engaging in conflict, the narcissist loses something they depend on most, your emotional reactions. Your silence becomes a boundary they cannot break and a clear sign that their control is fading. While they search for new ways to regain influence and validation, you begin rebuilding yourself. The silence that once felt painful slowly becomes a place of peace, helping you restore the confidence and identity that were worn down during the relationship. Every reaction you once gave, your tears, explanations, apologies, and attempts to fix things, reinforce their sense of power. By refusing to participate, you interrupt that cycle. This forces them to confront a reality they avoid, how dependent they are on your engagement to maintain their sense of control. Without your reactions, they have nothing to manipulate or use as proof of their influence. Rather than grieving the relationship in a healthy way, they become unsettled because they are losing the control that supported their ego. They replay past conversations, question why you changed, and wonder if someone else has replaced them. The uncertainty becomes increasingly difficult to tolerate. Ironically, your silence grows louder for them than it does for you. Unable to predict your next move or understand what is happening in your life, their confidence turns into anxiety and suspicion. They realize they are no longer at the center of your emotional world, and that loss of importance deeply unsettles them. Although it may seem like nothing is happening, they often begin cycling through familiar tactics to regain control. One of the first is hoovering, trying to pull you back with kind messages, nostalgic memories, apologies, or sudden vulnerability. These gestures are usually designed to reopen communication rather than create genuine change. If that doesn't work, they often shift to baiting. They may provoke you with criticism, cold behavior, or emotional drama, hoping you'll react. To them, the type of response doesn't matter. Anger, sadness, or frustration all serve the same purpose. They confirm they still have access to your emotions. Any reaction reassures them that they haven't completely lost their influence, while your continued silence reminds them that the power they once relied on is slipping away. They may post something online to spark jealousy, send a cold message to provoke anger, or manufacture drama in hopes that you'll respond to them. Any reaction, positive or negative, confirms they still matter in your emotional world. When silence takes away their influence, they often turn to hoovering, baiting, or triangulation to regain it. Triangulation involves bringing someone else into the picture, a new partner, an ex, a friend, or even a family member. They may flaunt a new relationship, hint that someone else values them more, or portray themselves as the victim of your silence. The goal isn't love or connection. It's to make you feel insecure, replaceable, or compelled to prove your worth. These behaviors aren't evidence of deep feelings. They reveal dependence on external validation. Without your attention, the narcissist loses an important source of emotional supply. So they desperately search for ways to restore their sense of control. As the silence continues, you may see it as peace, but they often experience it as a loss of power because their self-worth depends heavily on attention and emotional reactions. Your absence creates an internal void. At first, they may pretend they don't care, acting detached or indifferent. Over time, however, the lack of validation becomes much harder to ignore. Feelings of insignificance and irrelevance begin to surface, feelings they work hard to avoid. While they become increasingly unsettled, something very different happens within you. Your nervous system, conditioned by constant tension and unpredictability, finally begins to calm. At first, the quiet may feel uncomfortable because you've grown used to living in survival mode. Restlessness and anxiety are common responses, not signs of weakness. Gradually, the emotional fog starts to clear without constantly anticipating manipulation or conflict. Your thoughts become clearer, sleep improves, moments of genuine peace return, and you begin reconnecting with parts of yourself that had been buried beneath fear and self-doubt. This is what real healing looks like. It doesn't depend on their apology, explanation, or closure. As weeks become months, your silence changes from a fragile boundary into lasting strength. The narcissist may still attempt to re-enter your life through indirect messages, mutual acquaintances, or subtle attempts to provoke you, But those efforts no longer have the same effect. The words that once controlled your emotions lose their power. Eventually, you stop trying to understand every motive or predict every move. Your energy shifts away from managing their behavior and toward rebuilding your own life. The silence accomplishes what endless arguments never could. It cuts off the unhealthy dynamic that once fed them while giving you the space to recover. What once felt like emptiness becomes freedom. The silence you feared was never the end of your story. It was the beginning of a healthier one. While they struggle with the loss of control, you discover something far more valuable: peace, clarity, and the ability to move forward without carrying the weight of their influence.